Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first international deep dive panel of the Masters of the Tech Universe. Hi, Otávio. How are you?
Hello, Karina. How are you?
I'm doing good. Excited for this first episode.
Yeah, let's see what's gonna happen. And we have an amazing and spiritual first guest.
Yes, we do. And Otávio, although this is the first international episode of the Masters of the Tech Universe, we had already bunch of other episodes, right? More than 20?
I think so.
But they were all in Portuguese. So now we wanted to extend this for an international audience, so that we could actually bring more people to talk with us.
Yeah, that's the whole point, right? We decided to do that in part in English because easier to bring more people around the whole community. Because if you think about the whole world, um, just a few people are able to speak Portuguese, right? It's like you create a pencil with two erasers. It's become pointless. So that's why I decided to move on to English as well.
Did you just do that? Really? Like, okay,
Yeah.
that was move. That was move. Yeah, I like it. So, Otávio, one thing for those who are here for the first time, what means, like, why did we choose this name, Masters of the Tech Universe? Like, could you just go through talk about it, talk a little bit about it? Where did this
Yeah.
come from?
Okay, that comes from Karina and Noel. And the whole concept is about the audience is the mass of tech universe. Basically, we are here to learn from that audience and for sure from the guests.
Yeah, that is true. And one cool thing is that we are able to understand Portuguese, Spanish, and also Otávio can understand Italian. So if you
Italian,
and what
French.
Yes, so if you want to do ask your questions on the chat in the language that you feel more natural and more comfortable with, we can just translate it back to our guest. And today we have here a really active open source contributor. We have a principal software engineer from Camunda who has already worked in other open source companies, and I'll bring him on board. Mauricio Salatino, also known as Salaboy. Welcome, Salaboy. How are you doing?
Hello, Karina. Hello, Otavio. Thank you very much for having me on today's, webinar. This is awesome. And yeah, like pencil with two erasers, man. That's deep. I'm already learning something here, right? Like I will
Okay.
use that. I will code that, and I will just, give you the credits for that. That's deep thoughts. Awesome stuff.
Yes, that is true. Salaboy, thank you for accepting our invite. I couldn't have anyone better than you to talk about open source community, open source culture, and open source software here today.
And
So,
don't worry, it's my pleasure to give some advice about jokes. Do you
Awesome.
know when? Do you know when the phone is able to jump out the window?
Oh no,
the
when?
phone jump out the window.
Okay.
Yes, when it is in fly mode.
Awesome. That's a good one. Oh my. Oh my.
Salaboy is so polite. He's so polite, right? He's laughing about all these
Oh
jokes, but
my. Yes. I'm learning, man. I'm learning. I mean, I cannot do jokes in English. That's one of my things that I haven't been able to learn. So I'm learning here. I would just
Okay.
definitely take the advice.
Salaboy, so you have contributed for open source software for a while now. Like, how many years have you been contributing to the open source community already? Like, since the first one, do you have like an
I,
idea?
yeah, I would say that around like 12 years already. And
Wow.
for the last 12 years, I've been doing just purely open source, right? So from, like not basically, I cannot even remember if I had like any private repository. Like all my commits have been done in a public repository kind of thing. Since
Even for
since
the, like,
GitHub started.
playground stuff?
Yeah, everything is done in the open. I mean, I don't really need to I'm not doing anything that requires me to do any private source code. So I'm just doing everything in the open, and that's why I have like 400 repositories in my GitHub account. Most of them are just
Oh,
pet projects, and most of them are just forks from other projects. But I've been learning so much in the last 12 years that I don't plan to change that anytime soon.
could you enumerate that? I mean, could you list at least the principal ones?
Yeah, sure. So my first contribution to open source was around like single sign-on, and I started working with a friend that we were like really committed to say, yes, we want to start participating in open source projects. So we chose one project. It was JWOS single sign-on, like one of the first iterations of that project, and quite a complicated thing. Single sign-on, multiple services, like all the the parsing of the token and the credentials, passing across different services, different applications. It was really messy, but we managed to get that working for a setup that we couldn't for a customer. We were doing consulting at that time, and we sent it wasn't a pull request at that time. It was SVN, I think, and I don't even remember how did you
SVN?
call that. Yeah, that
I
was
don't
hosted in
know how.
SVN.
I don't think we have that concept.
I don't even remember how did you. I submitted a patch probably. Yeah, I submitted a patch for the changes that we want to apply, and that got accepted, and that was cool. And from there, I just jumped into the projects that I was more interested in. I became a Red Hat instructor for a project that was called JVPM back in the day, like the first versions
Was
of
and still
JVPM.
is.
Yeah, it was a different project, but yeah, that one.
Oh,
And
okay. Yeah.
yeah, it was the version 2 and 3. So I started like teaching about that, like giving like the official trainings, but still part of like the community, right? Like, and I started getting more and more involved with the project. So uh, you know you know how it goes. You start contributing to a project, then you become someone that really understands how the project works, and then you become like a potential hire candidate because they know you from the community, and that's basically what happened after contributing for a couple of 3-4 years around the project. Red Hat decided to hire me. That's why I moved here to London and started working on the project full time.
Oh, that's nice. Okay, usually when you talk about open source, we a lot of people also mention something about the Free Software Foundation, right? Do you know
That's
the
true.
difference between Open Source Institute and Free Software Foundation?
Yeah, definitely. There are loads of differences around that. It's like also like a historic kind of like question, right? The free software movement came before open source, and they were like defending a lot about like freedom. Like, so the free in Free Software Foundation, it's for freedom. They really promoted the idea that people can do whatever they wanted with the software, and they become quite popular. But what happened back in the day is that like business people that were like looking to create commercial products on top of it, they became a little bit scared about all these freedoms, because one of the things that the Free Software Foundation promoted is that everybody is free to change the software, but those changes needs to go back to the communities, right? And some companies didn't really like that. That's why the term open source was coined, and they created that term open source just to make sure that businesses are not so scared about those freedoms. So they defend some other things which are important, and sometimes people tend to confuse free software and open source. But if you are talking in a more commercial setup, open source is the term that it's becoming more and more popular since the 90s. So
Yeah, I read one huge discussion on the mail list about that,
mhm.
and Luis Vita, the right now the director from Open Source Institute, says some usually say something about, okay, Aussie is more to commerce, and free software is something about philosophical stuff. So if you
Yes,
let you just go through your mind, do a mindset, free software is your path. If you let you create a whole real product world, go to
to the
Aussie,
open source. Yeah,
to the open
yeah,
source.
and that's usually the case. Of course, like licenses are also involved, and licenses inside open source and free software, it's like a huge topic. So if you're interested more in that, like it's just a more deeper conversation on the legal terms of what it means when you create like a project that you want to share and that you want to make publicly available for people. And there are such much like different flavors of what you can do with that and how you can restrict what people do with your software and all that stuff. I'm a big fan of the Apache license, right? Like that, the version 2 of the Apache license. And I was super surprised today when I was doing some research that the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, is pushing for that license to be the default license for all their projects, which is kind of like a validation for what the license is. And just it represents that if you follow these licenses, you tend to be more like approved in the business setups where people is really after creating products and selling stuff, which makes a lot of sense because somebody needs to support these projects.
Yeah, that is true and exciting. I didn't know that, but I've once mentioned to a friend that he was creating a new application and he was planning to keep it closed. So I suggested that he should open it, and his worries was about like, okay, but what if someone forks my project, rename it, rebrand it, and resell it? Like, will they be able to do that? And like, should I worry about it? So I know that I feel that people are afraid of that when coming to the open source world. So could you talk a little bit about it, about this situation? Like, do you have this worry, and what do you think about it?
Yeah, totally. So there is like one thing in there, right? Like, first of all, you usually tend to have like open source projects around like common problems that people is trying to solve. So this kind of like groups or just a single person just creates a project. He or she is trying to solve a problem, and then people joins and start, collaborating into solving that problem. Usually these problems are not related to any, how do you say that? They are not related to any patents or things that are private, right? Like, things that you're going to use to make money. They are just more solutions to common problems that people have. So in that case, unless you are creating something that you think that it has like some intellectual property associated to it, where that you want to patent it, you just create it in an open source way. In general, then you just will go to something like, choose your license for defining which kind of like license do you want to use for your project, so that you can enforce some other people to behave in certain ways. And in general, what I mentioned before about the Apache license is that I tend to think that I'm protected as a developer in the same way that the business is protected from their own investments in the projects, right? And that basically means that someone else can come and fork my project. But also, if I'm working for a company that's following this license, I can also fork the project and go away and continue working on it, even if I'm leaving the company where I'm working for.
That is so true. Yes.
Yeah, and
I know that you've worked like as a leader for some projects in companies. So have you thought about doing that? Like, you know everything about the projects. Like, have you thought about forking it and just continuing it?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So, and that's always a possibility, right? Like forking projects, it's like the word has like some negative connotations of, now there is another version of this thing, and who is going to maintain it, right? So you need to be realistic about what you can do as a single person and where the community is going. So sometimes it makes a lot of sense to fork, sometimes makes a lot of sense to start with a new project, or sometimes just makes sense to switch and just start helping other projects as well that you like the direction where they're going, right? And that's quite normal, like in every industry, right? Like you do that. Like when you get tired of a job, you just go to another one. But in my case, forking, usually it's never an option unless you have two divergence paths that you want to take. One path wants to do something and another path wants to do something completely different. In those cases, you can decide to fork. And I've seen that happening before, and usually fragments the communities, and it's not a constructive thing usually, from my personal experience, right? I don't know if you guys have seen that happening before, and which kind of like projects do you have like in mind when you think about forking?
I just have two on my mind right now: Jenkins and Hudson, and MySQL and MariaDB. I mean, the whole
They
software industry.
yeah,
Just have two on my mind right now.
those two, right? Like they were not like, I mean, it feels like both were like bad outcomes in general. They were more like about trademarks and licenses and who owns the project, right? I don't know. I mean, there were like big gains. Any big gains? For me, it's always like, oh, now I have something else different that it's different. And I don't know which one to choose.
Yeah, right. And you were talking like about communities. So
Mhm.
does it make sense? Like, do you, Salaboy, consider a project, an open source project that doesn't have an active community? Like, do you consider that like it's still like open? It it is open source, but you know what I mean? Like, if you don't have a community, how can you just I don't
Yeah.
know. There's no open source software without a community. Do you agree with this?
Yeah, that's true, right? Like, so I could say that the open source project relevance will become more popular if there is an active community behind it, right? But projects usually start small, right? And until they do not like fulfill or just like solve a real problem, they do not get adopted. You don't get any attention. So there is like this curve that it's super flat at the beginning of the project, and then when people start realizing that there is something that is solving a problem that they are having, they start jumping on it. So communities kind of like grows and shrinks like over time. And I've seen that happening so many times. Like in even like in when I was working in Red Hat, you can see different projects being adopted at different times, different hypes, in the industry that push the adoption towards one way or the other. But yes, and creating communities and maintaining communities, it's super hard work and it requires a lot of investment. It's not something that happens automatically. You are
Okay.
creating communities here, so this is really good.
Yeah. At least we hope so. So,
Yeah.
Salabai, you have been working in the whole open source world over 12 years, as I mentioned before. And usually, when you go to any kind of conference, when you went to presentation, everybody says open source is amazing, open source is wonderful. But that's a real world, right? So, what are the problems that you usually face on the open source side?
Yeah, totally. There are a bunch of things. They are not. It's open source is not perfect. Open source is not free, right? Like that's kind of like the first assumptions that we all need to understand. Um, Main problems that I've seen is like, and you need to take this between quotes because I will say it, but again, it's just my opinion. Open source is usually slower, right, than any other development because in order to develop in an open source community, you need consensus. You need to make sure that there is like the right governance on top of the project in order to do the right things for the community that it's pushing for that project moving forward. And those decisions usually take more time, right? If you do something closed source with 10 a team of 10 people, they will just go really fast. If you want to do it in the open, well, that might take more time because there might be a community member that raised some very valid points, and it takes time. That's one of the things. The other thing is like, again, like open source is not free. Open source tends to get really, really messy. And I've collected a bunch of links in a Git repository around that because I had a friend who is here in the call. I can see his comments. Ryan Dawson. He created a couple of articles around that, like the pains around open source. I will put it in YouTube. Let me
You
see.
won't be able to share it on YouTube. You can share it
Yeah,
on the private chat here, and then I can share it with them.
yeah,
Otherwise, YouTube just blocks it.
yeah. I
Like
think
people won't see it.
I put it there in YouTube. I will put it here as well. But yeah, that's kind of like you can take a look at those articles because that is so true. There are tons of things that tends to get messy in open source projects. One of the things that really surprised me, I've started like playing a lot with Go lately, and when you use the Go language, one of the things that you do is you host your dependencies in GitHub, and what
Mhm.
can happen is that people can remove the GitHub repositories, and then your dependency goes away. So unless you cache that dependency in some way, crazy way, that dependency is no longer there. And then it's up to you, the one who is adopting these open source projects, to make sure that you can build your own software that it's based on other open source libraries. So these kind of details, they tend to get really, really messy. And usually when you adopt open source, you should expect to have like a technical team that is trained enough, well trained enough to understand how to deal with these complexities, right? If you have that skill set in your company, adopting open source shouldn't be a problem. Does that make sense?
And yeah, that makes sense. But how about the people inside the open source community, like the developers, product leader? Did you face any kind of ego issue?
Yeah,
Like, I want this way because I don't care about your opinion.
there is a
Uh,
lot. There is a lot of that in open source communities, right? There is a lot of egos around it, and it's very difficult to lead an open source project. That's why I was mentioning before governance. That's becoming a thing, right? If you take a look at the new initiatives, like, and I would use the CNCF as kind of like one of the biggest ones nowadays. If you take a look at that, they have like clear governance, directions on how to decide who is the ones that which people is in charge of making the hard decisions, and how problems gets resolved, and all these kind of things. And from my perspective, as I'm a developer, right? I'm not like a product manager or a leader in that sense. So for me, governance, it's always something that I'm a little bit scared of looking into. But it's, of course, that if you are in a big open source project, that becomes really important. And I'm starting to get more and more into that, for me to understand kind of like what the dynamics are, because it is complex. And again, it's not only about egos; it's also about companies and the companies behind these open source projects. Sometimes you have companies and projects that are doing some crazy things, and when you push that into an open source arena, it becomes really interesting. I've been following the Knative project, which it was created by Google. Now it's becoming more like multi-company project, but there is still friction there, right? So you can clearly see that they are trying to figure out who is going to make the toughest decisions, and how they allow their own community to push forward in the right direction without like involving companies and companies' interests that might be related to the project and the financing behind all these things. So it's super interesting for me. So I'm really passionate about that.
And I think that is cool that like even the contributors, the developers who are just in the community, they are not part of the company itself. They can also change the way the place, the goal, the final goal, or where the product is going. So I saw one of your GitHub issues in the Jenkins X project.
Oh
So
yeah.
I'd like you to tell us just a little bit about the story. Why did you open it? What was it about? And how did it impact the future of
Yeah.
Jenkins X?
Yeah, that was an interesting thing. So I joined the Jenkins X team when, well, I joined the community when they kind of like first released the project, like almost 3 years ago. And it was quite interesting because they were coming to do something which was moving, kind of like creating the cloud native approach of what Jenkins is. I guess that if you're a Java developer, you kind of know what Jenkins is, right? And they were trying to do that for Kubernetes, and that's kind of like a big project, big change, and they wanted to re-architect everything, rewrite it in Go, for example, not in Java. And it was interesting to me, and I got really involved in that community. And what happened is that I was like interacting every day, not every day, but every week in the community, and just talking with the core developers and just saying, okay, I'm using it, I'm reporting issues, I'm fixing some issues, I'm just getting involved, I'm just trying to be part of the planning of the project and trying to understand what the roadmap is, and just making sure that the entire community understand where they were going, right? And what happens is that at some point, like the core developers just completely disappeared from Slack, right? Like from one day to the next, they were not there. They were not answering messages, and that's when you kind of like realize that there's something going on there, that it's not right, right? And after a while, after 2 or 3 months of that, like complete silence, I saw like a blog post saying that they
Two
decided.
or 3 months?
Yeah, 2 or 3 months. Yeah, and
Ooh,
how is that? It's like the first month
yeah,
you
but
think, okay, they might be on holidays, right? Like the first month you say, okay, they might be on holidays, or they might be doing something in private that they need to do, and that's fine, right? Like that's perfectly fine. It's totally understandable. But after 3 months, I saw a blog post saying that they decided to make some bits like closed source, which is fine. I mean, I'm super fine with doing some of the stuff that you want to sell in a different way. But the thing in there is like, there was some of the things that they want to do in private, some of the things that the community was pushing like really, really hard on getting done, right? So I wrote a blog post saying, yeah, I'm not entirely happy with this. And I started being vocal about that, right? And after that blog post, the company, they really started having like interesting conversations about how to move the project forward. And after a while, another month or so, they come up with this, a new alternative, and now the
Open
new version.
conversations.
Most of them private conversations, like internal company private conversations on how to continue with the open source side, and until finally they made, I think, what is the right decision of allow the core developers to keep doing Jenkins X in the open, and doing at least the community bits, like the things that are really important for the community, in the open and completely transparent. So I was quite happy with the output, because I saw something, I reported it, I raised my hand, and then the company behind the project, which is the main sponsor of the project, they hear it, and they change, and they made some changes in order to make that happen. So it was a really interesting experience for me, because being outside of the company, being able to influence how like a big company that's making money change the direction based on what the community is saying, it was really important. The funny thing is that I created a GitHub issue with the blog post, and I got like, I don't know, like 40 or 50 votes, which is kind of like a lot for an issue. So from one day to the next, it was like the most hype, like the most priority issues that they need to solve, and that push, of course, the company to say, yeah, there is something that the community really wants to do, and they need a solution for it, and they did it. So I'm quite happy that the results were positive.
Well, I had one question about that, because usually, I mean, at least in the Java
Yes.
world, when you talk about open source, we usually talk also about politician stuffs. My question is, when you go to the open source world, do I need to handle the politician
So
stuff?
you mean about the politics, right? Like politics around projects.
Politic,
Yeah.
yes, politics. Thank you.
And unfortunately, yes. And that's something that if you are like an open source developer, that's something that you need to be aware of, right? Because no matter in which company do you work for, politics will always like pop up in some way or another. I would say that 5 years ago, when I was still young, I thought about like, I don't care about politics. I will never get involved in politics. But the more I get older, the more I understand that code is important, but also making sure that the governance of the project is done right, and also understanding the requirements from like the business sponsors, the companies behind the projects, is also important, right? So you need to keep everyone happy. You need to collaborate with everyone, and then you need to influence. And the funny thing about influence in open source is that you get more influence by contributing more, and not because your title says it that you have more power. And that for me was like a super big lesson that I've learned by contributing to projects. The more you contribute, the more power that you have, the more the stronger is that your voice is. It doesn't really matter if you work for that company or not. So it's pretty different of what you're used to if you're working for a private company, where there is a hierarchy, like a pyramid, that you cannot speak louder than your boss, for example.
Yeah, that is so true. Yeah. I can only see like everything you're saying now reflected on the real world that I live. But yeah. Anyway, so just one thing, as before we continue. So if you were watching, feel free to share any questions that you have, and we'll make sure that we will bring this to Salaboy. Okay, so this is an interactive talk. I know that this is the first one we are doing in English, but feel free to share any questions you have, or comments, opinions, anything you like polemic stuff. He's here for this, right?
Of course. Do you want to ask in Portuguese if they are, if they have any questions about open source in particular that they want us to tackle? I mean, we can talk about anything here. So
Yeah, you can translate in a way.
of course.
Okay. So please go on.
No, I just wanted to say that this is something that I completely recommend. It's called Open Organization, and it was funny. Like I was probably already 7 years into working for open source projects when I read this book that it's written by Jim from Red Hat and now IBM, I guess. Now he's IBM CTO, CEO.
Yeah, he became a
don't
president. Jim
Fine.
White.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. So that book, it's really interesting. I mean, it's a very short book, but it basically explains why and how to work. And in general, like what I found most amazing is that I was already working in that way, but I never saw it like in written, right? Like this is like written for people that it's not working in open source projects and not working in companies that promotes open source. And it's easily like you can quickly understand why and the benefits and how this business can be created and get money from it. And there are like loads of different point of views, but this book kind of like highlights the main core concepts that you need to be aware of if you want to push like open source forward in your company or in different organizations. So totally recommend it. It's a short, very, very short book, very straight to the point, clear examples. And again, for me, it was like, yeah, if I can explain open source, this kind of like book does it for me in 100 pages, I think. Well,
Okay.
200 pages.
Karen, do you want to do some kind of question? Can I go ahead?
Just go ahead, my friend.
Okay.
Just
open source and standard. Which one you'd like to choose, and why?
Oh no, yes, definitely open source. Open source first. And I was trying to look for a reference around that, but I couldn't find it. And again, this is something that is changing in our industry, and I think that the cloud transformation is coming along that. It's like that idea of let's get stuff working first, and then let's create the standards on top of the things that are already working, instead of the other way around. For some reason in our industry, like there are a lot of standard like organizations that just create standards and then they see if they get adopted or not. So what I'm seeing more and more in this last 5 years is that no, let's get projects up and running, working, and then let's create standards on top of that. And I do believe more and more on that like lately. So I would say open source first, then standards will come at some point.
Yeah, it makes sense. That is true. We have a question here from Anderson Barros Cândido. Anderson, sorry. So, what are the killer tips? Killer tips to get and keep engaged in an open source project as the side work. So you already have paid like the work you have to do every day, 8 hours a day, and you still want to contribute. Do you have any tips on how you can do that?
Yes, totally. So first of all, find an open source project that really interests you, right? Like don't work in something that you just do to be part of an open source project. You need to find something that really motivates you to keep working on it, right? And then it's, at least in my experience, it was kind of like natural, right? Based on my contributions to an open source project, then I can look for a job that it's using that project, or at least it's close to be using that project. And then you can promote your project into the companies that you're working for. That will definitely keeps you motivated. Another thing that you can do is you can look for integrations between different communities, right? So if you're working for a project and you go out and look at what other communities or projects you can integrate with it, that will definitely keeps you motivated because you will start knowing different people from different communities, and that's a very rewarding learning experience. So I totally recommend you to check these two things first, like, find something that you really like, and then reach out to other communities to see if you can integrate your favorite open source project with other open source projects. That will give you so much work that will keep you interested for a while.
Nice. Yeah, that's true. Thanks for the tips, Salaboy. And I have another question here.
Good.
So I see that there are companies that they actually have part of their software open, like they have their code open, and they monetize it upon closed software, like closed code. Like when they have their upstream project, and then when they want to sell it, it comes with extra things that are not in the open. Can this type of software still be called like open source, or do they have to like say, okay, how to deal? Like, is this common? Is this like a good practice?
Yeah, totally. And yeah, that's usually what it's called, or like open core, right? So you have part of your project's open core. That's kind of like the term that people use to describe these kind of things, right? Like, so you have part that it's open source, it's available, you can just go change it and do whatever you want. And then the company on top, they decide how much stuff they build on top in order to monetize it, right? And it's usually tooling. At least what I'm seeing is like you have, engines and libraries that do something very specific, and then on top you have tools in order to visualize and maintain the software up and running for long periods of time, and that's what they sell. And I'm all it for that, because that's basically a way for people to monetize it. And the more I think about it, the more it becomes less relevant with all this cloud stuff and software as a service, right?
That's a super good point.
Yeah, and that's something that I'm struggling with lately. I keep thinking about, okay, so how do you monetize open source when you're like giving like a software as a service thing? Because the rules, they completely change. If you used to sell something that you built on top of an open source project, was one thing, you sell like licenses or subscriptions or whatever. Now if you deliver that as a software as a service, now it's a service. The people consuming that, some of them care that it's open source, but that's not the main, decisive thing. Now they will be looking for features. So in order to differentiate there in a service, you need to have more features than your competition. It's not in the same way as before with open source, that you need to be the more performant one, or the one that it's easier to get installed, or whatever, right? Now somebody else is taking care of maintaining that software for you, and that's the only one who is interested in the fact that it's open source or not. And as we mentioned before, building it in an open source way, it will take you more time. So now I can see definitely companies struggling to say, okay, should we need to do it open source if we are delivering a software as a service platform, or we can just do it closed source, or how do we deal with that, right? Very interesting and philosophical kind of like discussion for us to think about.
Yeah. Furthermore, if you have any kind of open source products under Apache or Eclipse Foundation, we need to follow the procedure. For example, if you'd like
Yeah.
to release, I need to release once in a month in Apache, twice in a month in Eclipse Foundation.
Yeah.
Therefore, if I find any kind of bugs, like day two, I need to wait until the next month to release
Yeah.
a new version. And if you have any kind of people who pay to you, probably need to release an early
Mhm.
version with that fix, with that security stuff, and to don't let a lot of people waiting for. And
Exactly.
that's
And
usually okay. Go
yeah,
ahead.
no, that's exactly the point, right? Like, and I do see that, for example, in the Java communities and in the Java foundations, like the Apache Foundation and the Eclipse Foundation, they
Yes.
come with this legacy way of working, right? And when you go into the software as a service model, you do like 20 releases a day, and well, there is kind of like a mismatch there. And I do see these foundations trying to change, and these different organizations and people around they are trying to change. I tweeted like a couple of days ago. I was trying to use a project, and there was a Maven artifact being released into Maven Central that was released like 10 days ago, literally. Like it was like 12 days ago from now, and it was already obsolete. So, and you say it's it's already obsolete, right? Like I cannot even use it today with the latest version of the project that I'm trying to use. So
It,
that basically means that we need to adapt. We definitely need to change our ways of
yeah.
working for that.
The whole organization are changing a lot right now. Usually in the Apache world, we have a product, and under this product, we have a company. Like Cassandra, it has data stacks.
Mm-hmm.
Hadoop, we have Cloudera, and the
Exactly.
whole world right now are moving to offer any kind of service. What I mean, if you have Cassandra, we have
Mm-hmm.
Cassandra as a service,
Yep.
Apache Confluence, a
Mm-hmm.
Kafka as a service, and so on. So yeah,
Yep.
that's a huge challenge right now in any kind of.
Under like the trade-offs, right? Because I understand like when we go to a more closed environment, to a closed world, let's put it like that. I understand that the the gains of it, the pros. But still, even if you are offering something as a service, be it platform, service, whatever, you can still work with open source. It is still feasible. It's more hard. It's harder, but still feasible. So I wonder, like, the balance, right? I still need to see, like, the balance.
The whole point is possible, but sometimes you're not able to wait too much. So, like in Apache project, you have the option to release every day and release again as open source the next month. Remember that you have the CVE, right? The
the
security
vulnerability.
issue.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And that's a issue. Right now, also beyond that, we have some part of the API that change too much. And this point does not make sense to become open source. No, because it's crucial to the whole business. It's because if somebody decides to use it, it's gonna be a huge nightmare to explain. Like, okay, don't use that.
Yeah.
You have product that will change like every day, 7, 8 times daily.
Yeah.
Because they have a huge amount of engineer behind that.
Yeah.
If you decide to take that piece and become open source, would you explain what happened that piece? You probably is gonna change again.
Exactly.
And
Then you work with the communities. So no more communities in the SaaS world.
No. So no. Let's
no, okay,
Let's not forget that you have like.
Otavio, went away. Come on, come down, Otavio. You can still be.
No. Communities first, right? And I guess that's the main power behind having like a community is that you will definitely get a more mature software, and probably covering more use cases because you have more people looking into how you are solving the problem. So the solution tends to be much more robust, and covering more angles than a solution that you can create on your own. But yeah, at the end of the day, when you sell that as a service, then you need to provide some other warranties to your consumers. And I guess that's kind of like the world that we live into now. We need to deal with those things, and we need to live with those delays into releasing. Sometimes creating internal releases, sometimes having different version streams, and sometimes just making sure that the community has their own places where they can experiment and go as fast as they can, while the product side and the service offerings, they go a little bit slower, because that's all right. Going back to Cassandra and all these projects in Apache that have their own communities, it's kind of funny to see that now the main problem that they're facing is that you can have Amazon packaging that up and selling that as their own service, and and that's super funny. So you start seeing in different projects changing the licenses, so other cloud providers, they cannot do that with their open source projects, and that's creating a nightmare.
I didn't follow. Are they changing their licenses today?
Yeah. There are companies that are doing that just to make sure that that nobody can provide like a software as a service version of their open source projects.
yeah, the community is still alive, right? That's why Eclipse Foundation has rewriting the license to handle the modules, small piece, and the cloud as service. And because Apache is bigger, that means lower than Eclipse Foundation. Probably they're gonna release a new version of license to support cloud as a service as well.
Yeah, and going back to that, like the speed of changes, right? And I think that, again, I will mention this again, the CNCF is doing a great job in there. You see Kubernetes going super fast, and you have like 5 major companies releasing Kubernetes as as a service, and that's a pain because, again, it's changing so fast that they need to maintain backward compatibility on some of the things.
That's a great example, actually.
And it's huge. I mean, but they are doing it, so it basically means that it can be done. Now the rest of the industry needs to adapt to these new ways of working. So it's going to take time, but at least we have the perfect examples there that it's being done. It's being done, and it's kind of working. It's not perfect, but it's working, and it's going to get better from now on. So we have the perfect examples to go and copy from it.
That is true. I'll bring a question that will take us to another to a different scope right now. So let's say that you are working in a company today and they are creating something super like revolutionary. Would you keep it open from day one, or would you wait for it to get more mature and release it only later?
Yeah, good question. It really depends on what, right? Again, if it's a trading algorithm, I will keep it closed because that's again related to something that it's kind of like an invention. It might be related to a patent or something that you want to keep closed. If it's not that case, I will just do it open from day one, in the
From day
sense
one?
that yeah, from day one, I will just write the first line of code, in the open. And again, like being involved with the Jenkins X projects, that's how they do it. Like they just write everything in public. They do all the discussions in public. And I can clearly see the advantage of doing that because they get more eyes on the decisions that they make. So they have like, when they make a decision, they know that it's the right decision because they have 100 comments from people out there that they're trying to solve the same problem, saying, yeah, that's the right direction to go. So even if it's small, even if you have like 2 or 3 people from the outside just validating that your idea is the right one, just for me, it's totally worth it.
Yeah, besides, if you are a small company, if you have a small team,
Yep,
nobody cares about you at that
that's
first
true.
step. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
And maybe that's the opportunity to share the knowledge what you have right now to
mhm,
become popular because that.
yeah,
And I saw that happen several times on Apache Foundation itself and Eclipse Foundation.
yeah,
Um, the Eclipse collection happened because a lot of people are able to do that directly on the OpenJDK, right? And right now there's a huge discussion to take some piece of that collection and move back to OpenJDK.
makes sense, right? It makes sense.
Yes.
So yeah, you should just leverage that idea of communities and people that wants to solve a problem in just by just opening your stuff and just working with some other people. Like collaboration nowadays is a must, and it's important. I can see the question there in the comments here. Could you indicate
I'm keeping that one. I'm keeping that one
you want to leave it
uh,
for the
for
last?
the end.
Yeah, we can
Yes,
keep it.
not the last, but almost the last one. Because the
Okay, sounds
last
good.
one we have a tradition, like
Ooh,
even though
Let's
we've
keep
like
it.
yeah, we always have a traditional closing question we'll bring for you at the end.
perfect.
Okay,
Sounds good.
so actually I was thinking here, we are talking about like open source, which links to code, but the open culture goes beyond, right? So a cool story, for example, is that I heard actually this week is that the plane invention, and I'm just like talking about this right now. I didn't plan, Otavio, pardon, but it's really interesting because someone created the plane before Santos Dumont, but they were
Hmm.
like working on the closed world so that people wouldn't steal their invention. And
Yeah,
since Santos Dumont was the first one to actually like create it all in the open so that everyone could see it, he was the one entitled as being the creator of the airplane. So it's pretty cool. And yeah, it's what, Otavio, why are you smiling?
Oh, that's a huge discussion.
So, come on.
yeah. I I guess that yeah, I guess that you have a point in there in the sense of like if you do it in the open, you will have that track record, right, of your trajectory, right? And after for me, after 12 years, I can go back to GitHub and see what I've done. And it's a funny thing, but I've never used like I never like for the last 3 companies that I work for. That means the last 10 years. I've never had like a real interview or I needed to write like a CV because I already have my blog and my GitHub account, right? And I was always hired based on that, based on my
Yeah, that's
public
true.
profile, and that's it.
That's true.
So it definitely opens a lot of doors because it's like both ways. You get hired by people that knows you, and you kind of know the people that's hiring you because you know what they are doing and you kind of like them. So it's two ways
Yeah.
relationship there that
No,
works
no,
really well.
that's real true. Because usually bring two people when you decide to do something like public. You bring haters for sure. A lot of
Yep.
people who waiting for any kind of opportunity to put you down.
Yeah.
But yeah, we have amazing companies, a lot of people who are looking for you. Okay, I'd like to create a Jenkins. Why not invite Sailor Boy to do any kind of stuff? Why not invite a guy who are spending bunch of time on that project, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that's all about communities. I mean, there are a lot of communities that are not company related. So there are a lot of communities that are not even, there is no like a big company behind them. And I can think about one like, for example, J Hipster. It's a project that I really love, and it's a crazy community because again, it's being built by the bunch of crazy guys, and it's so good. I mean, they are
Yeah.
like researching on how to use all these tools to make us like more efficient in the Java world, and they are not, when you go to their meetings and when you see what they are doing, it's clear that there is no company pushing for just a single direction. There are a bunch of people pushing in completely different directions, and all the things that they are bringing into the table are super important, and we all benefit from it. So I tend to keep close to these communities because you tend to like learn a lot. If you want to do all that research on your own, it will take you so much time. You can just rely on these other people to do it for you. So super good. Always tap into open source communities, and you will keep learning.
Yeah, that is true. And by the way, I mentioned the culture thing because like in this open source thing, because not only like code
Yeah,
can follow these cultures. So an example of this is the like people who write together. Like people just get together and start writing a book, and it's all versioned and it's all there and publicly available for other people. So there are other types of commitments and projects that can come out of it, right? Of out
yeah,
of this culture. It's pretty nice.
yeah. It's
So
it's not always code. That's true. It's just discussions, and documentation and whatever. If you got want to get involved in an open source project, you don't really need to only think about code nowadays.
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, social soft skill as well, like communication. You
Yeah,
learn communication. You you learn also how can lead with trade-offs, to negotiate your idea, to because you can have an amazing idea. However, if you're not able to take that idea and write down and any kind of documentation,
yeah,
your idea become useless.
yeah.
So I learned a lot of stuff on the open source side as well. The English itself, I just decided to learn English because I like to communicate with another people from the whole Java community.
Yes, yes, and that's one main thing, right? Like, and again, I'm getting older, so I'm starting to have new problems in my open source journey. It's changing.
Oh, this guy is
It's
look
so
at how much white hair
look
he
at
has
look
on
at this
his
hair.
head,
This is
right
crazy.
here.
Yeah, but because of that, like that's a very good point, right? Like, and again, my feeling today, 2020, around open source and communication is Chinese. I want to start learning that because yeah, because I want to, I want to create my first pull request for a Chinese repository. Well, I don't know why,
Yeah,
but you can think of that. Like when I was younger, like English was the main tool for me to communicate with the rest of the world. Now I see a lot of things going on, in Chinese, and I do not have any idea of what's going on in there. So definitely want to keep an eye on that and maybe use Google Translate for the next couple of years because it's going to take me quite a lot to learn Chinese. But again, like, when I think about collaborations, I'm just thinking about that. Like, okay, how do we keep an eye on these projects that are happening in there and what is actually happening in there that we need to be aware of? I don't know why,
Yeah.
guys, what do you think about that? I know that sounds crazy, but
It does, but it kind of makes sense.
right.
It does make sense, but I wouldn't do it today myself. Maybe later. Would you, Otavio?
Yeah,
Otavio actually is doing it. How many languages do you know today, Otavio?
that's crazy.
no, but just five because it's nearby
Just
Latin,
five. But
The
anyway,
Latin one, yeah.
uh, the Latin one, because Chinese is totally different and
It's
a little bit
complete.
hard. Yes.
It's yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy hard. At least for me, like French is hard for me, man. So French and German,
Oh, French is
impossible.
a nightmare language. Even to us who has a Latin language as native one, like Portuguese, Spanish, French is still a nightmare to me.
Good.
The whole pronunciation thing, the number itself, like
That's
It's too hard to understand why this nowadays.
Come on,
it is.
let's go back to open source. Let's go back to
Go
the
back
open
to
source.
open source.
So let's bring the question from Mateus. So could you indicate some open source projects for those who are starting now in the open source world?
Yeah, I'm super passionate about open source, and I tend to offer these in the conferences where tend to speak. If you are starting in open source and you want to get some kind of like mentoring, feel free to drop me a message in Twitter or something, and I will try to help you to get started with the project. We will need to find the right project for you. It's not every project is not for everyone, right? So I can, I've shared the link with this repository that has a couple of projects that I'm working on today, but they involve a certain set of technologies that you might not be familiar or that maybe you are not even interested in. So for me, the most important thing is to find the right project at the right level for your thing, right? Like if you are Java, you find like a Java project that you can participate into. If you are JavaScript, you just find the right project there, right? And what I'm becoming more and more proficient into is that finding a project, no matter what project it is, and then just figuring out the best way for me to contribute to that project. So if somebody wants to drop me a message in Twitter or in LinkedIn or in GitHub or whatever, just get in touch, and I'm super happy to help you to get started with that, because it's not that difficult as it sounds. It's way more simple, right? You just need to be able to put some time into it, right? And usually that time comes after you finish your work, which is not something that everybody wants to do.
Okay. There is time to the last question.
Good.
Sailor boy, when not to use open source software?
That's
It is not just about create. You cannot use.
Salah boy, oh my
so
god.
yeah, that's a tough question. So the question is like when I shouldn't use, like myself, or when everyone else?
I mean, for people, when would
Okay,
you?
well, for
When
people.
should
Yeah.
people not adopt an open source solution?
Oh, when they shouldn't adopt their own personal solution.
Yes, when they should not use. Exactly. You see the point here.
I do see it. Yeah. So when I guess that when you can save time and money by adopting something that it's easier for you to adopt, right? And again, that's becoming a more and more common, right? Like you can go to any of the cloud providers and just use the services. And then you will not be maybe just using their own proprietary software in there. You need to be aware of that when you do that, then you are just locked in with that vendor, right? Nowadays, that's changing so much that even if you adopt something that is proprietary, there will be some kind of like APIs and interfaces that will allow you to switch, but always look for that, right? So for me, nowadays, if you can save time and money by adopting something that gives you a quick solution for the problem that you are trying to solve, just go ahead and do it. Then later on, you might reevaluate if you want to switch to an open source thing or not. Does that make sense? What do you think, guys?
Yeah.
Is that something similar to what you would say? Karina, what do you think? when couldn't you use open source?
Oh boy, that's a tough question for me actually, because I'm so pro sharing, but if you can't find a really good, mature, and supported solution in the open, maybe that's when you should go for a closed option. But if you have that option in the open, I wouldn't switch. So that's my take on it.
What about you, Ottavio?
When you don't care, when's that not your business? Like
Like what?
like any kind of SaaS. I mean, I don't care
Okay.
about inbox. I just use Gmail. That's a private one. I don't care how to storage my open source product itself. GitHub is a closed source, right? So
Yeah, it is the
I don't
same.
care. Let's
Yeah,
use GitHub.
it is the same kind of like answer that I have when people ask me why I do not like use Ubuntu or Linux, right? Like in my machine, I'm running in a Mac here, and my answer is I'm a super Linux fan, right? Like I'm really into Linux. I've used Ubuntu for lots of years, and previously I used Debian, but the main thing is that now I found a solution that takes care of all the operating system and all the updates and all that stuff.
It's kind of
faster, right? I don't really need to build it. And before, when I was young, I was happy to rebuild the kernel and make it work with my sound, driver. But now I just do not have the time, so I just choose like the fastest option. I'm not saying that it's the best, but it's the one that it's giving me, my time back to do whatever.
it
I need
saves
to
time. It saves time.
I prefer to spend time creating open source than just being like a passive user of open source. I really like to be like an active open source, participator that goes to open source and gives back, instead of like just using open source and just saying that, yeah, I like open source because I'm just using it.
I mean, we are around the closed source everywhere. So the microwave software probably is a closed one.
Yeah.
The flight tickets software, the plane software. I mean, it's not hurt, right? Sometimes you need to use.
Yeah, and that's the good thing. It's like, I think that's why also like the term open source was coined, that idea of not being so extremist, like on saying everything needs to be free and everything needs to be open, right? Like, it's just, okay, the right tools for the right thing and at the right time, right? Depending on where you are in the journey. So
Lovely, lovely. What a great discussion, guys. Thank you. Before we close, I'd like to ask Salaboy if you want to share any social media where people can get in touch with you or follow your work.
Sure. So at Salaboy, it's my Twitter account. In GitHub, I am at Salaboy as well. And I have my blog, which is salaboy.com. It's pretty simple. It's just short. Like everywhere, like you search for Salaboy, you will find me. Get in touch. If you want any mentorship around like open source to get started, just ping me, drop me an email, and we will just work together, for sure.
Is your email also salaboy@gmail.com?
It is, yes. Hopefully we don't we don't have like any like spam robots here like scanning the call. But no, that should be fine. It's not private, it's public. So feel free to write me. Don't be shy. Like usually, developers tends to be shy on writing other developers, but yeah, I'm super open and I will happily help as many developers as I can.
Perfect. Thank you, Salaboy, for joining us today.
Thank you, folks, for having me. It's a pleasure. Hopefully we will do more in the future.
Sure. We can talk about
please.
Jenkins someday. Let's talk about it. So thank you, Salaboy. Have a great day. Let me show you the path to the backstage. Otávio, thank you for being my awesome co-host. Can I see you here the next Monday at 2 p.m. Brazil time again? You are on mute. You are on mute.
I know. That's supposed to be a joke. Yes, why not? See you again Monday.
Sure. See you then. Thank you for watching. See you next Monday. Bye-bye.